At Fort Bragg, life had a way of grinding you down. For a soldier in the United States Special Forces, the constant pressure of drills, deployments, and the weight of responsibility was relentless. But for him, the escape was simple, something familiar, something comforting. A greasy bag of fast food from the local KFC was the perfect way to unwind after a long day. That night, it wasn't just hunger driving him, it was the craving for the comfort of fried chicken, something he had known all his life, growing up in the South. He sat in his small, sparsely decorated barracks room. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the blinds. His military gear lay scattered around him, boots tossed in one corner, his uniform hanging loosely on the back of a chair. But none of that mattered now. In his hands was the bag of KFC, his favorite. The familiar aroma filled the room, momentarily pushing away the stress of the day. Usually, he would go for the famous potato bowl, but tonight, he decided to change things up. Chicken tenders seemed like the right choice, something simple. There was something else lingering in the air that night, a haze that clouded his thoughts. A hit of K2, synthetic cannabinoids, had left him in an altered state, his mind slightly adrift. The effects had kicked in just as he settled down to eat, but that was part of the appeal. He didn't care about the world around him, just the food in front of him. He opened the box, feeling the warmth of the tenders, completely unaware that his simple comfort meal was about to turn into a waking nightmare. He opened the box of chicken tenders, the golden, crispy coating catching the dim light of the barracks room. The smell was intoxicating, filling the space with the rich, greasy aroma of fried food. The tenders sat neatly in the box, their crunchy texture calling to him. He could feel his mouth watering, anticipation building with each passing second. He reached in, picking up the first tender, the warmth of it radiating through his fingers. As he took a bite, the familiar flavor of the seasoned breading and tender meat hit his taste buds, providing the comfort he had been craving. Each bite seemed to ease the tension in his body, the stress of the day melting away with every chew. The room around him felt far less important now. There was just him and the food, but even in his hazy state, something felt off. The tenders were fine, tasty even, but there was a strange texture in one bite, something slightly tougher, grittier. He paused for a moment, looking down at the next tender in his hand. It seemed normal, perfectly fried, but that sensation lingered in his mind. He shrugged it off and continued eating, figuring it was just a bad bite, nothing more. As he reached for another tender, the effects of the K2 intensified. His vision blurred at the edges, the room swaying slightly in his peripheral. The tenders, which moments ago had seemed so appetizing, now looked slightly different, almost distorted, like they didn't quite belong. But his hunger was stronger than his unease, and he took another bite, forcing himself to focus on the food, trying to ignore the strange sensation creeping into his mind. Something was definitely not right. As the soldier continued eating, the effects of the K2 started to take a firmer hold on his senses. The room around him began to warp, as if the walls were subtly bending inward, closing in on him. The familiar surroundings of the barracks seemed to shift, like the reality he knew was distorting. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but the world felt slippery, as if it were slowly unraveling. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for another tender. The once warm, golden brown chicken now looked strange, almost surreal. The breading seemed darker, almost burnt in places, and the crispy texture he had enjoyed earlier was now oddly rough, as if the tenders were no longer quite right. The familiar comfort food he'd been savoring minutes before now felt alien, unsettling. His vision blurred again, the edges of the room swimming in his periphery. The lights flickered briefly, casting unsettling shadows across the floor. He took another bite, but this time, the taste wasn't what he remembered. The texture was wrong, tougher, chewier. He looked down at the tender in his hand, confusion washing over him. The chicken felt heavier now, as if it wasn't just a piece of meat but something more, something unnatural. His heart began to race. He tried to shake off the paranoia creeping into his mind, blaming the K2 for the unsettling sensations. But no matter how much he tried to ground himself, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. The once comforting smells and tastes of fried chicken had turned into something sinister, like the very food he was eating had become part of the growing nightmare around him. Halfway through his meal, the soldier paused. Something strange caught his eye, buried among the tenders. At first glance, it looked like just another piece of chicken, but there was something off about it. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The K2 clouded his thoughts, making it hard to focus, but there was no mistaking it, something was staring back at him. He reached into the box and pulled out what he thought was another tender. But as he brought it closer, the shape was unmistakable. His hand froze in midair, heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't just a tender. It was a chicken's head. A burnt, blackened, breaded head. The beak was barely visible beneath the crispy coating, and the comb, once bright and fleshy, was twisted and fried to a crisp. But the worst part was the eye. A single black eye stared back at him from beneath the layers of breading, hollow and lifeless, yet somehow full of a terrible presence. The head was grotesque, the skin crispy and charred, like it had been left to burn too long. He could see the details of the feathers, crisped and fused into the batter. The beak was partially open, frozen in what looked like a scream, and the eye, it was still there, coated in black breading, but unmistakable. A fried, lifeless chicken eye staring straight into his soul. His stomach churned violently. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been moments away from biting into it. The horror of what was in his hand made his skin crawl. He dropped the head back into the box, recoiling in shock and disgust. His appetite vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that spread through his entire body. The soldier recoiled, his breath quickened through him. The fried chicken head had been just a few inches from his mouth, and now it lay in the box like a macabre trophy. He felt bile rise in his throat, and his stomach twisted in knots. He could hardly comprehend what he had just seen. A chicken head. How could it be there? Who would do such a thing? His mind raced as he struggled to process the horror of the moment. He was a soldier, trained to face threats on the battlefield, yet here he was, paralyzed by a piece of fried chicken. The eye, black and empty, seemed to follow him as he stumbled back, the world around him fading into a blur. Every instinct screamed at him to get away from the horror before him. He held the box across the room, watching in horror as it flew through the air. The sound of the chicken head hitting the wall echoed through the barracks, a sickening splat that sent waves of nausea crashing over him. The tenders scattered like fallen soldiers, but it was the head that haunted his vision. It sat there, grotesque and mocking, as if daring him to come closer. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and he staggered back, his heart racing. The barracks room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. He dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach as the realization of what he had almost eaten crashed down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the remnants of the meal had somehow turned against him. Vomit rose in his throat, and he barely made it to the wastebasket before he lost control, heaving uncontrollably as his mind spiraled into chaos. He had faced enemies in combat, but nothing could prepare him for this grotesque betrayal. The soldier recoiled, his breath quickening as panic surged through him. The fried chicken head had been just a few inches from his mouth, and now it lay in the box like a macabre trophy. He felt bile rise in his throat, and his stomach twisted in knots. He could hardly comprehend what he had just seen. A chicken head. How could it be there? Who would do such a thing? His mind raced as he struggled to process the horror of the moment. He was a soldier, trained to face threats on the battlefield, yet here he was, paralyzed by a piece of fried chicken. The eye, black and empty, seemed to follow him as he stumbled back, the world around him fading into a blur. Every instinct screamed at him to get away from the horror before him. He held the box across the room, watching in horror as it flew through the air. The sound of the chicken head hitting the wall echoed through the barracks, a sickening splat that sent waves of nausea crashing over him. The tenders scattered like fallen soldiers, but it was the head that haunted his vision. It sat there, grotesque and mocking, as if daring him to come closer. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and he staggered back, his heart racing. The barracks room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. He dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach as the realization of what he had almost eaten crashed down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the remnants of the meal had somehow turned against him. Vomit rose in his throat, and he barely made it to the wastebasket before he lost control, heaving uncontrollably as his mind spiraled into chaos. He had faced enemies in combat, but nothing could prepare him for this grotesque betrayal. The soldier sat on the floor of his barracks, the chill of the linoleum seeping through his uniform as he stared blankly at the mess he had created. The scattered remains of his meal were strewn across the room, bits of breading and chicken lying like debris from an explosion. But his gaze kept drifting back to the chicken head, still nestled in the corner, its fried eye staring into the void. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, silently judging him with that black, soulless gaze. Days passed and the head stayed right where it landed, tainting the room with its presence. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, couldn't even look at it for too long without a wave of nausea sweeping over him. His mind kept replaying that split second, the moment he almost bit into it, almost consumed something that should never have been in his meal. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the burnt beak, the twisted, fried cone, and that haunting eye, as if the head was now seared into his memory. The incident began to eat away at him. He avoided the mess hall, barely able to stomach anything but water and the occasional cracker. His fellow soldiers noticed his sudden change, the hollow look in his eyes, the way he flinched at the smell of anything fried. Rumors started spreading, whispers of what had happened, and soon, no one in his company dared touch the local KFC. The horror had seeped into their lives as well. Each night, as he lay in bed, the image of the chicken head crept back into his mind. War had prepared him for many things, but not for this silent, unrelenting horror that had found its way into his daily life, consuming him from the inside out. Weeks passed, but the horror refused to leave him. Every time he sat down to eat, the soldier could feel that lifeless, blackened eye watching, lurking in the depths of his memory. Even the simplest foods now unsettled him, the specter of the chicken head haunting each bite. His hands would shake as he reached for a meal, and his mind would flash back to that grotesque beak, that twisted, burnt eye. It was relentless, gnawing at him, a trauma he couldn't escape. The soldier's nights grew restless, plagued by twisted dreams that left him drenched in sweat. Each night, he'd find himself back in that moment, the chicken head inches from his mouth, its lifeless eye somehow filled with a chilling awareness. In his dreams, it wasn't just staring, it was watching him, studying him with an unnatural intensity. He'd wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, his mind trapped in a loop of terror he couldn't escape. As the weeks wore on, his comrades grew concerned. They'd seen men break under the stress of combat, but this was different. He was unraveling from within, haunted by something they couldn't understand. Every meal became a torment. He'd sit down with a tray, only to find his stomach churning, the memory of the chicken head flooding back with each attempt to eat. Food had turned from comfort to horror, a trigger for the trauma lodged deep in his mind. Seeking relief, he finally turned to the base therapist. As he recounted the story, he felt the shame and horror all over again, the memory raw and visceral. But even then, he knew that healing wouldn't be simple. Some fears never truly let go. Months had passed, yet the memory clung to him like a shadow, an inescapable reminder of the bizarre horror he'd endured. Sitting in the therapist's office, he tried to piece together why something so seemingly trivial had shaken him to his core. He was a soldier, conditioned to face life's worst, yet this experience had left a wound that no battlefield ever had. Each session, he unpacked the terror of that night in the barracks, describing the haunting image of the fried chicken head with its burnt beak and dark, hollow eye. It was surreal, even to him, how an ordinary meal had transformed into a personal nightmare. The therapist listened patiently, understanding that trauma isn't always logical. Sometimes it hides in the unexpected, seizing moments we don't expect to haunt us. Despite the therapy, he knew he'd never be the same. Food no longer brought comfort, every meal carried the risk of another horrific surprise. Even the simple act of eating demanded caution. He was left with an unshakable truth, one he'd never forget, that horror could find you anywhere, even in a box of fried chicken. And sometimes it was the smallest things that left the deepest scars. Months turned into years, but the memory of that chicken head lingered, haunting him like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. He had been through intense battles, both physical and mental, but nothing had left a mark like that grotesque discovery in his KFC meal. His friends and family noticed the change, a nervousness, a shadow that seemed to hover around him. He avoided restaurants altogether, and even homemade meals made him uneasy. With time, his discomfort became part of him. Meals were rituals of inspection, each bite requiring scrutiny. In public, he pretended it was no big deal, laughed it off as just a quirk left over from military days, but inside, he was always wary. The simplest foods would sometimes take on a sinister quality, and he'd flash back to that fried, blackened eye staring up at him, a constant reminder of how quickly normalcy can turn into horror. He tried to shake it off, to bury the memory as just one bizarre incident among many, but it remained stubbornly lodged in his mind. He'd come to understand that some experiences never leave you. No matter how far he moved forward, that box from KFC had left a scar, invisible but forever there.